Hello, I'm Andy Weinstein, and welcome to What Are You Waiting For? This is a podcast by GODOT. We are a waste-to-energy company focusing on taking large streams of waste, converting it into hydrochar, and then into products of existing and growing demand like hydrogen and food-grade CO2. Today I have Jayden, who is our intern, on the call, and we're going to first do an interview with him and understand what got him motivated to focus on climate and why does he want to join us as an intern and what's his plan for the next 4 years. Jayden, welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Hey, everyone.
Thank you. Do you mind just giving a quick intro of your background and kind of what got you here?
Of course. My name is Jayden Wan. I'm an incoming freshman at Stanford University. I'm trying to go explore their civil engineering program, which is in part why you know, I'm so curious about Godot and its solutions because I do have a great passion for the built and natural environment. Throughout high school, I think more and more I've started to learn the importance of you know kind of the unsexy stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
The infrastructure, talk about our energy. It's things that sometimes myself I know I take for granted, but I've also learned I think the great capacity for impact that they have, not just say on our environment, but really our lives as a whole. That's in part why I'm here today.
Nice. Was there a specific moment that got you interested in climate and
Yeah,
addressing, circular economy? What was there a triggering moment in your life that made you interested in this space?
yeah. It must have been the transition between eighth and ninth grade. I think that summer, I joined a program. They were offering a $500 stipend, so it didn't really matter what the program was. I just, that enough attracted me to it. But it was actually by the San Mateo County Office of Education. It was the Youth Climate Ambassadors program, which the name itself is pretty self-explanatory. But my experience there really revolved around both education, as in I was the learner. I was learning about climate change, the issues, as well as the solutions, right? And I got some hands-on experience working out in the field, working with adults, working in my school to try and make some change at the institutional level. I think that was probably my first exposure to really just this idea of climate, the environment, climate change. But ultimately, I think that blossomed into something more along the way.
Okay. And so you're young, graduating high school. So that was only 4 years ago. But when you joined that group, was there like some besides the $500 stipend, which you can't say no to that. Was there something kind of eventful or like an aha moment that kind of hit you in this space?
Yeah, one thing that I'd always struggled, and I'm sure a lot of my peers can relate to this, trying to find this quote unquote passion in my life, right? I think often when you get around to the age of going to high school, at least nowadays, they'll tell you, hey, find your passion, find something you're good at, be great at it. And I didn't really have much of that, at least until I joined that program. And the reason why specifically, I saw that spark both in myself and also the movement was because I knew and I was taught that this climate movement was something growing, right? It wasn't just something that had happened in the history textbooks and, we're just observers now reflecting on the past, but rather that this sustainability movement, the environmental movement, but really the solutions and the issues that were manifesting kind of here today, not only were they clear and present, but they needed innovation, they needed people, right? They needed youth, they needed advocates, right? I think being able to identify that gap as well as kind of the momentum, the trajectory towards which we were heading, that inspired me to really just ride the wave, see where it took me, because I knew that, if nothing else, I would be joining a great movement. Of course, 4 years since then, it's grown really, really quite a bit.
That's great. So give me an example of an event or an opportunity or a situation that you experienced in your life where you felt like, oh, this was directly related to sustainability or climate change that had a big effect? And I'll just give you one example from my past. So when I was growing up, we had fires in Oakland, and I remember being in Alameda looking up at the Oakland Hills where I lived and seeing the fire and the heat distortion making us believe that our house was gone. And it was like this moment where I was holding in one hand. I was 5, so it was deeply impactful. I was 5 or 7. It was 91, so I was 7. But I just remember holding. I had a tape cassette, so this shows my age. That was the Police, and then I had a bunch of Legos in my other hand as I watched my house burn, and realized and that helplessness that you saw, that made me start to think about the impacts of everything. And then over time, I got to see more and more use cases where climate was front and center, despite people saying, oh, that's a future problem. So, do you have a moment like that where, like, my Oakland fire moment for you?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think we kind of may or may not have grown up in the same area, but I'm here in San Mateo County. The weather here is great, and I think one maybe distinct moment, and you could compare it to the other people around the world who are really deeply influenced by climate every day. I feel like here in the county we've really just had a little taste of it. There was one day during the pandemic. I think it must have been really at the start of it, so around like March in 2020. We actually did have some fires locally. I think it must have been Santa Cruz Mountains, something like that. And you know, kind of a similar experience. We had this sky that was completely orange. you know, you would wake up and you would think, hey, it's still nighttime, but it actually wasn't. It looked something like almost apocalyptic, right?
Yeah.
There was something had gone wrong, right? You didn't know quite what until you turned on the news, but just intuitively you could think, hey, something's not right.
Yeah.
But also being able to see, say, the reactions of my parents, kind of the adults around me, right? They had never had something like this happen in their lifetime, right? Which was a little bit of an indicator to me that maybe this is something new, right? It's not like, oh, it's just another thing, it's all cyclical that just passed by, but this was something new, right? Something new to me, but also to the people who I cared about. And I think that it was actually around the same time that I actually enrolled in that San Mateo County Youth Climate Ambassadors program. So me, I kind of put two and two together. I think that, I'm thinking about it now, that must have been one of the reasons why I had that curiosity towards it.
Awesome, awesome. And so now that you're kind of passionate for this, and can you tell me a little bit about the work that you've done with the Silicon Valley Youth Climate Action?
Yeah, yeah. Silicon Valley Youth Climate Action. It's kind of a mouthful of a name. We always say that. And the acronym is SVICA, which is a little less of a mouthful, but
It's
the work
still,
that we
it's 5-letter acronyms are not really that short. So
yes, yes. I guess you say it enough times, it just rolls right off the tongue.
yeah.
But we're a youth-led nonprofit, meaning that it's youth-led, but we collaborate a lot with adults. Youth-led
Mm.
nonprofit that empowers teens and young adults to combat climate change, specifically through policy and education. I often like to think of it as making change at the institutional level, right? Beyond, say, just one individual, right, who is, say, picking up trash around their community. You often hear about beach cleanups organized by teenagers. We're trying to break some of the precedent of the environmental movement and trying to get youth to think a little more critically about how it is that they can maximize their capacity for change, considering that these are high schoolers. We know that it's difficult for, say, a high schooler to get in contact with the president, right? It's hard for anyone to get into contact with the president or even the governor, right? A
Mm.
state senator. That's not very intuitive to navigate that. But, working, say, at the local level, wherein we're talking to, say, city council members or schools, right? we're actively making change in the schools that we attend 5 days a week.
Mm.
That's something that is closer to home and is something that we're trying to really capitalize on, in the sense that if we have youth advocates who are actively making this cause and effect advocacy to solution impact, then that's something that, as climate advocates, we can share to the world. Hey, rather than just advocating for over, like, 4 years for a bill to go through the House, we can actually make change right here in our community as high schoolers, and actually really contribute to solving this global crisis.
Yeah, so it sounds like you're essentially pulling up a chair, right? You're not necessarily at the table, but you want to be at the table, so you're pulling up your folding chair.
Yes.
There's a great quote from Shirley Chisholm, who was the first black woman to run for president, and actually the first woman to run for president. And she says basically, if you're not at the table, pull up a folding chair, right? What you've been working with at the Silicon Youth Climate Action, it's been basically that, right? How do I get in front of people who are the decision makers and have my voice heard in a format that's not always passing bills or something like that? Like, at the end of the day, if people don't hear your voice, they don't know it exists. And so you've basically taken that opportunity and kind of led that way. And what is your current role in that group?
Yeah, currently I'm the youth director. We actually just created that position a couple months ago. So you could say I recently got a promotion. I recently got promoted to that of a youth director. But I just quickly want to echo, I think, some of what you're saying is that, yes, we want to make our voice heard, but we also want to do it in a way that is conducive to the system, in the sense that, often when you think about climate, you would hear about, say, protests, right, in the streets. You would hear about, all these environmental advocates or activists who are, throwing soup at the Mona Lisa as a means by which to, really make this issue public. I think to some extent, of course, we do want to get our voices heard, but we also, want to make it so that we're actually playing by the system. Sometimes that's what it takes, is that you can kind of play outside the system, but you also need people who sit there for long city council meetings where they talk about, say, maybe more mundane topics like the water infrastructure, and they talk about, the rent prices. At least to a high school student, that's not the kind of things that you can get on TikTok. But it is, in some sense, the work that we do is unique in that we really try and give youth that real world exposure. But going back to the question about the role as youth director,
Mm.
my main goal is to empower others. Right? It's kind of a win-win in that, if I'm empowering others, it means that I have less work to do, but it also means that those who are looking for work to do, they get their demands met. So it's my job really to, I would say, coordinate opportunity, and also make sure that, as we expand the organization, we get new recruits every day. We want to make sure that we're able to expand a really consistent, as well as really just make things scalable successfully. Because sometimes, you can stretch yourself out too thin. I mean, there's all kinds of different things that can emerge when you're dealing with, hundreds and hundreds of high schoolers in one organization.
Yeah, well, you're on your way out from high school. You're going to college. You've accepted the offer to go to Stanford. So now that you're going to be a Cardinal, what does that mean? What are you looking forward to in college? What are you looking to do? Obviously, whatever you say today, you're not going to be held to in the next 4 years, because every single person that went to college said I had this specific plan and then they deviated. It's totally fine to do that, but kind of what is this emotion of going to Stanford? What do you expect to get out of it? And yeah,
Yeah, don't quote me.
uh, you're going on the internet, and the internet never forgets. So
Oh, oh wow. I think heading to Stanford, it was really interesting. I went to this admit weekend last week, and gosh, so many people there doing computer science. It almost gives me some FOMO. So who knows? Who knows? But I think, yeah, and I've thought about this maybe for around 4 years now. It's kind of, and that's kind of the system that we live in, where it's, people right as they're going into high school, they start to think about, okay, what do I do for university? At least if you're in the Bay Area, I think there's a big pressure to do that. So I have been thinking about it for a while. I think my goal as of now, heading to Stanford, is to pursue their civil engineering program. And specifically, I think, not only to say, become a civil engineer, but also I think really capitalize on say what I've learned throughout high school, throughout my life. See, hey, is there a place for civil engineering specifically to have a great impact on being able to solve the climate crisis? As in, I
Yeah,
know
no,
that.
yeah, no, and I would say that civil engineering is key ingredient for anything in the built world, right? Because I think a lot of people want to have these they want to throw pennies at dollar problems, and they're like, I can create a software that will reduce blah blah blah. Well, at the end of the day, you need physical assets to change physical things into other physical things. For us, we're going to try to turn apples into hydrogen. That requires some civil engineering. And I think a lot of people forget about that as you talk about everybody's going for computer science. I will bet in a year, half of those people will change. There is um, a huge movement right now of trying to find like a destination what you study that's going to be safer for the future. And I can tell you, all of the things that were safe back in the day are not going to be safe in the future. The concept of white collar jobs versus blue collar jobs is probably going to go away as we move to a much more digital and automated world. And as we talk about those things, is there anything that you think Stanford has that will give you kind of a unique edge as you explore kind of essentially this physical world, built world environment?
Yeah, yeah. I think, one thing that I've thought about and that I've also been encouraging some of my younger peers to take advantage of is this intersection between, I would say, STEM and ESG, as in this idea that, you could be an amazing engineer. There's so many different kinds, but I think being able to go to an institution where not only can you be a great engineer, but you can be a purposeful engineer. You can actually work on issues that aren't just created and solved by some corporate entity, but rather you could actually take on challenges that are bigger than just something that you might get out of a typical career path. I think that's something that I'm looking to do because I think it takes great solutions to address this great problem that we're facing. And I feel like being able to go to an institution like Stanford, where students are encouraged to think big, right? Not just in terms of a career, but really just the impact that they have on the rest of the world, which is lofty thinking. But I think it's something that at least I can aspire to, right? Something that I hope my peers can aspire to. It's something that I think regardless of whether it comes to fruition or to what extent it does, it's something that I myself personally can feel confident in, right? Being able to know that out there at least is the potential for me to maximize, say, the influence that this school has and the resources at my disposal to actually fulfill what seems like a right now really challenging task.
Yeah. Well, let's take a step back into history, and why don't you give us a little background on like growing up? Where did you said you're in San Mateo County now. Give me a little bit more background of like your family. How did you get to where you are? You know, how long have you lived in the Bay Area? Give me a little background on that.
Yeah, yeah. No, I recently, over that admit weekend, we went to a lecture, and one of the professors, it was kind of like a mock lecture. They wanted to give you some exposure. One of the professors said, none of you deserve to go here because it's really just your biology and your environment that's led you here, as in we're just the sum of that. When I think about kind of how it is that I grew up actually primarily in Daly City, and we moved to the city of Burlingame a while back. So, of course, still in San Mateo County, but definitely being able to grow up. I think it's different kinds of exposure to different environments. It is, not only has that contrast kind of informed my personal taste, right? And say, hey, there's a difference between, sunny and foggy weather. That makes a difference, right? I've noticed that just contrasting the two. But also professionally, I've gotten to notice the differences, right, in how it is that certain areas with average socioeconomic status are compared to others with higher socioeconomic status, right? Kind of like wealth distribution. I've noticed things about the built environment, kind of that equity aspect of it as well. I think that's maybe one thing that is a
Well,
bit more germane to our conversation.
yeah, give me so you grew up in Birmingham, right?
Yeah,
And Daly City. But tell me about your parents. Tell me about kind of different things growing up. Do you have siblings? Kind of, are you the oldest, youngest? Give me some good background.
yeah. No, I think my parents they immigrated here to the States. I think it must have been in their teens, which around my age actually. So around my age, I think my father came from Hong Kong, came here to Los Angeles, and then he moved to San Francisco for college. And then my mother came to San Francisco first, kind of stayed there her whole life. That was something that I've always found interesting, right? The immigrant experience. Um, and I think it worked out pretty well. At least it seems like they've been able to achieve a lot, just considering then and now that difference. So I'm proud of them. I think they're proud of themselves. I actually do have an older brother. He's at the University of Southern California right now studying public health. I actually have a really good time with him. I know that a lot of the times the stereotype is, siblings argue and, well, especially if you're two guys, I'm not sure how deep the emotional connection typically is, but me and my brother were tight. He helps me out when I need it, and I try and do the same for him, even though he's a couple years older. Yeah, I feel like I've lived in actually still living in a great family.
Mhm.
I'm very lucky to be here to have this kind of support around me, and it's also why I think I want to transform some of that privilege into something that can be really distributed across the community, right? Make use of my resources and this life I've been given.
Awesome. And then I have these are going to be the left field questions.
Let's
So,
do it. Let's do it.
favorite music.
It's actually recently been changing. I've been talking to so many people, and I think being able to, this is one thing I'm really excited to do going into college is not having to conform, say, to, my peers back in high school. A lot of the times that social inclusivity can be defined by, say, what media you consume, right? Whether that's, social media or you're talking about, something on Spotify. I must say, recently I've been listening to jazz, which is, myself personally, I've always loved jazz, but I've kind of suppressed it throughout the years just because it's not the go-to for most high schoolers.
Are we a Thelonious Monk fan? Let's talk jazz. Where or are you going to be in like the Herbie Hancock where you have that kind of jazz fusion introduction of the mood? Let's go deep on this one.
Yeah.
Why jazz? Do you play an instrument?
Mine is a little more subtle, I would say, in that actually I did used to play the trumpet. It's still sitting there in my closet. I had like a lip injury a while ago, so I'm kind of I've resigned from that position, but it's okay. Um,
I didn't have a lip injury. I just stopped practicing in the trombone, so I
Yeah, no, but I love bossa nova. Bossa nova. I don't know. I'm not sure if it's helping me learn Spanish or not, but at least it all sounds nice. There's bossa nova. There's also some kind of more big band jazz, right? You talk
Okay.
about Count Basie, Duke Ellington, kind of the great names out there. I can relate to. I think really what I'm interested in jazz is this idea that it can serve not only as something you can put in the background while you're studying, but it's also something that you can use just almost in like any experience that you're going through. There's sad jazz, there's uplifting jazz, there's the kind of jazz that makes you get up and dance. One thing that I really appreciate about jazz is its interpretability.
Hmm.
I feel like and I do like a couple R&B artists who are kind of from Gen Z, right? Gen Z tastes.
Okay.
But I definitely noticed that some of the music, specifically with the lyrics, I find sometimes can be a little conforming, right? Sometimes I don't relate too much to the lyrics that are being expressed or the artist's lives, right? That goes for rap, that goes for some R&B. But with jazz, I mean, so much of it just feels universal. Maybe I'm just talking in the abstract here, but
No,
it's
no, no. It's good to hear. After this, we'll do some music exchange.
yeah.
But now, looking 50 years down the line, when you're at the tail end of your career, how do you want to be remembered?
That's something It reminds me of an experience that I'm currently working on with another group called Elders Climate Action. I work with a group called Elders Climate Action, which is also, it's pretty much the elder equivalent or older folks equivalent of Silicon Valley Climate Action. So you can kind of deduce what they're all about, Elders Climate Action. But I think one thing that I've learned collaborated, collaborated with them on a variety of projects, and even working, still in that policy education domain, right? Trying to make institutional for change with climate, as well as being able to, educate local communities on it. One thing I've learned from working with people who are, really like my grandfather's age, in their 70s or 80s, is that, and this is going to sound a little corny, but it's never too early to start being a good ancestor. That's one thing that we always say, as in it really ties into the idea that you don't have to wait until, say, you know 50 years later to start thinking about, hey, how do I want to be remembered? But I can start thinking about that right now, and then I guess in that sense it kind of shifts the trajectory, kind of like a, self-fulfilling prophecy that, right now if I start thinking about how I want to be remembered, then 50 years later, I mean, I'll probably still, there'll be kind of a connection there, right? An alignment in the mission and values. I'll know that 50 years later, I'll have thought, oh, well, 50 years before, I was always, I was thinking about how I wanted to be remembered anyway. So I can just kind of check in on that. And I guess it makes it a little less novel when it comes to the kind of introspection that I have to do later, right? I can just say, oh, well, I've always wanted to do that, right? So
So, how do you want to be remembered?
I think for myself, it's, yes, I think about the kind of impact that I can make, right? Say in the professional world, right? I'd imagine in 50 years, hopefully we're leaving the planet in a better place than it was 50 years before. I really am hopeful that we achieve that. But of course, not only professionally, but also personally, right? I think by then, hopefully I'll have a family, right? I think 50 years later, I'll be around 67, not, not too bad. But I think by then it'll seem like maybe I'm, probably a little past the prime of my career, or maybe not, right? Maybe by then I would take on more of like a kind of, they call it like an encore career
Mhm.
type transition. I feel like maybe the way that I would want to be remembered is someone who made impact not just for the world, right? And that's a very lofty thing to say again, but also someone who, say, took care of his family, right? Who helped people out when they needed it. Someone who's not just able to think about, say, the big picture, right? We talk about, the greater good and climate change and solving the world's issues, but also someone who kind of took care of the tasks at home, right? Someone who
Mhm.
was responsible for taking out the trash and washing the dishes, someone who could clean up their room. And hey, I'm working on that.
Yeah, don't worry. I'm in the same boat on the cleaning up the room part. It doesn't always improve with age. I'll give you an example of, like, for me, growing up in the Pepsi system. I always was exposed to big, bold marketing campaigns that I felt like were talking to me. But in the end of the day, I realize now that it was just about selling sugar water in plastic containers. But growing up, I was like, I was born in 1984. I was born on July 4th. So, like, you know, I feel like a sense of patriotism that only is because I was born on this day. And actually, I didn't, for like the first 28 years of my life, I spent more birthdays abroad than in the US. So, in a weird way, I was always in environments where I was like talking about Independence Day and my birthday at the same time in this foreign environment with this backdrop of like Pepsi. And so I've always thought about, like, how do I become the choice of the next generation? What does that mean? How do we actually take advantage of this distribution system that is everywhere, right? Wherever you can buy a carbonated beverage, we have somebody's driving a truck, somebody's filled that up, and that has needs for different things. So as I've gone into Godot, one of the things that I started to realize was I'm actually I'm just enacting the dreams of myself as a little kid, where I'm trying to be the change that is necessary at a level that is global, because that's how my brain has always thought. I've always looked at this like global world, uh, kind of, disconnected groups of bottlers who are bottling beverage and distributing it locally. That I realize we can actually be something way more than that, right? When you talk about beverage, you're talking about carbonation. Carbonation is food grade CO2. What we're looking to do is create the food grade CO2 from these waste streams. These are all things that are essentially reinforcing my background of being this Pepsi bottler who wants to be the change that is needed. And a very long time ago, when I was lobbying with the American Beverage Association, I also realized since I was at the table, I might as well have my voice heard. And that's something that most people feel like they don't actually have a voice. It's weird. It's like we enter these spaces and we feel almost like we don't belong. But the reality, if you're present, you belong. And I think a big thing for me kind of going up is how do I use my opportunity and my presence to do change, to affect change, provide a voice for people who are not present. And when you talk about climate change in general, I see it as like a huge thing where there's a lot of voices who are not heard because they are, they are stakeholders, not shareholders. And I think one of the big things that, what's for me, that's really exciting, with talking with you and talking with all these different youth groups is really the energy, right? They are understanding that we are in a stakeholder world, not a shareholder world. And I think what we're seeing right now is like the last grips of that shareholder world trying to maintain power. But the arc of justice it bends in the right direction, right? And so I'm super excited to have you on. I really appreciate you answering my questions.
Oh, thank you.
We will be doing more of these. You'll probably have more role, not as in front of the camera as much, but that's what happens as intern.
Yep.
When I was an intern, I painted floors to make for a music video. So
Where can I get that kind of
I've
job?
done intern stuff, and I understand there's a lot of fun in it. There's a lot of non fun things, but what you start to realize is it just takes a lot of different people working together to get stuff done.
Yeah,
And
that's very
I
true.
really appreciate you supporting us because what we can do at scale is address a significant amount of the greenhouse gases, both in the transportation of fuels and fizz, but also in generating the fuel and fizz that's needed. So on that note, I'm gonna sign us off. Thank you so
Appreciate
much.
it.
I'm gonna
Thank
play
you, man.
my incredible little outro music that I put together with AI. It's a banger.
Yeah, that's pretty much jazz.
Thank you. This was the first episode of What Are You Waiting For? By Godot.